Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Committee for Racial Justice. I'm Angela Scott, a steering committee member for the Committee for Racial Justice, and this is our monthly meeting. We know that you could be doing other things right now, but you've chosen to be with us, and for that, we are extremely grateful. We hope this evening is going to be a time for robust conversation, reflection, education, and healing. May this evening also be an evening that provides a catalyst for action. We know that this work is tough and difficult, but we thank you for being with us on this journey as we strive to create transformational change. Again, welcome to the Committee for Racial Justice. This is our September meeting, and this one is titled How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. A couple of our steering committee members have heard our speaker this evening, Ms. Leah Rothstein. She's a subject matter expert, and so this evening we are blessed to have her speak as well. She is the co-author with her father, Richard Rothstein, on Just Action, a sequel to The Color of Law. I am excited about this. I will share briefly. I am in the process of working on my doctorate in organizational change and leadership, and we did talk about this past weekend in our immersion, and I also did have the honor of speaking with our dean, Dr. Pedro Noguero. I'll share about that later, but I love the work that we're doing here, and I'm excited about this work. I am now going to hand over to Ms. Hajar Muscat St. Clair. She's going to give us an update right now on the state of Black America. Hajar?
Good evening. I'm Hajar Muqtasid St. Clair. And about 2 weeks ago, I attended an event that was hosted at the Santa Monica Main Library. A lot of people here were there. It was the State of Black Los Angeles County. I just wanted to read you some notes that I had from there. Their overall conclusion of the event stated, Black people are core to the strength and fabric of Los Angeles County. As a result, the county's overall well-being and success depends upon the collective well-being and, success depends upon the collective well-being and success of its Black residents. To realize this, the county must take steps to undo the harm caused by anti-Black racism and implement policies that will enable Black people to thrive. We look forward to embarking on the journey of creating a Los Angeles County for all. And I'm sorry, but I'm in the car driving back from San Diego, but I also wanted to share some other points. This report that was written about 4 months ago was written by a doctor there, and it was led by a team led by Dr. D'Artagnan Scorza, who's the executive director of racial equity. Some of the points that he brought up out of this report were that Los Angeles has the most diverse population, but also has the most segregated population. 80% of the county's current poverty is in historically redlined areas. Black males have a 92% chance of incarceration if they didn't graduate from high school. Some key points that he pointed out also were 16% reduction in the Black population in LA County jails. Something that really stuck to me from that presentation was that other populations get 10 to 15 times more retirement benefits, years of retirement benefits off the backs of Black Americans, since our life expectancy is 6 to 12 years shorter than white and Asian counterparts. There was an increase in Black male community college graduation, and the study concluded that we need centers for Black health equity, that we need to create affordable housing communities, and that they need to invest more in community-based organizations. This event was well attended by many active local activists. Unfortunately, only one of our city council members was there, Caroline Rosis. So it was good to see her, but it was unfortunate that we didn't see any other representation from various departments in the city. Thank you.
Azure, real quick, I did want to say, just to give a little bit of background information, the vision and the mission of LA County's vision for racial equity and the RD mission. The vision, as stated, is Los Angeles County is a place where all residents are healthy, experience justice, and thrive. Therefore, the mission is to end structural racism and its consequences in Los Angeles County, to boldly articulate an anti-racist agenda that will guide, govern, and increase the county's ongoing commitment to fighting systemic and institutional racism in all its forms and dimensions by directing, building capacity for, and sustaining the development of equitable policy, workforce culture, data analysis, and resource distribution. I think, and thank you, Hajer, for attending the meeting and even bringing back a report. Again, as we stated, this is the work that we do. We are a conduit here at the Committee for Racial Justice in that we are helping to create this, I guess we could say, working within the system, working within the cities to change the policy within Santa Monica holistically in this anti-Black environment that we're in right now. So like I said, the work is difficult, but we thank everyone on here who is doing this journey with us. At this time, I am going to hand off to, I believe I'm going to Robbie, if I'm not mistaken. Or Janet, did you have any words, Janet or Joanne?
I think we're going to Joanne. Oh, you're muted. Maybe unmute you. Can you unmute Joanne and Robbie?
Yeah, I just clicked it for them to unmute. So hopefully.
Hold on, there we are.
There we are.
Okay. All
Thank
right.
you.
So we're having trouble with technology tonight. Our usual tech people aren't here, and so we're not able. I'm looking at the screen right now, and I don't see that you all can see who's in the room. Can you see who's in the room?
No, we cannot. We can only see you and Robbie, but I think we can move forward.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, without delaying anymore.
All right. For those of you who are not real familiar with the Committee for Racial Justice, we have been in existence, Angela probably said, since 2011. And we've been working in various arenas, the schools, the criminal justice system, and housing. Those are the three big areas that we've been focusing on over these years. So that's why we're so pleased to have Leah with us tonight to talk more about the housing situation. But I wanted to just bring you up to date on we've been mentioning the civic center situation, and some of you may have seen an early press release that said that one of the school board members was speaking tonight, but it turned out she was not able to come. So what I'm just going to tell you is that we are now at a point where the school district has done a feasibility study to try to purchase the civic center and the land around it. But the other proposal that was before the city council was coming from the Community Corporation, which is a low-income housing developer. And their proposal included not only retrofitting the Civic Center, but using some of the land for affordable housing. So CRJ's position is still that we hope, however this plays out, there will be some consideration given to using some of that land for affordable housing, because it sits on, the Civic Center sits on land that was taken in the 1950s by eminent domain by the city council then, in order to build it, the Civic Center, and it ended up destroying a very vibrant black and brown residential neighborhood. So that's why we're pushing for somebody to start realizing that if the black apology that the city council passed has any meaning whatsoever, they should take seriously using some of that land for affordable housing. So that's all I have to bring you up to date on that with. And so Robbie's going to introduce our speaker tonight.
Yay. You guys can see me, right? Hear me at least. The audience here can see me, and so I'm fine with that. I haven't known this young woman very long, but I usually judge people in my family does so. My grandmother, as soon as I would introduce her to, I grew up in this neighborhood, and I'd introduce my grandmother to my friends or whatever, and she would immediately ask them, who are your people? And that was because in our community, we kind of want to know who your family is, and that helps us to understand a little more about you. So the first person that I met with our speaker tonight was her mom. And her mom was absolutely wonderful and amazing. And so when it was time for me to go and to be introduced to Leah, I already felt like I kind of knew her or knew things about her. And, you know, I was just real excited to meet her and hear about the book that she has written with her father. And I also had met him as well. So, I kind of knew a little bit about who her people were. And so it made me feel really good about asking her to come here and present to you all. Besides, the knowledge that she has is just amazing. So Leah Rothstein is a co-author with Richard Rothstein of Just Action, a sequel to The Color of Law. If any of you have read that. While in The Color of Law, Mr. Rothstein described how government policy created residential segregation. Just Action describes how local community groups can begin to redress the wrongs of segregation. Leah has worked on public policy and community change from the grassroots to the halls of government, led research on reforming community corrections policy and practice to be focused on rehabilitation, not punishment, and this is what happens when you read on your phone, and has been a consultant to nonprofit housing developers, cities and counties, redevelopment agencies, and private firms on a community development and affordable housing policy, practice and finance. So that qualifies her, as far as I'm concerned, to speak on this. Her policy work is informed by her years as a labor and community organizer, working on issues such as housing, environmental justice, workplace safety, and youth leadership. Leah received a bachelor's degree from UC Santa Cruz and a master's in public policy from the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. And we are so excited, as Angela said, we have been doing a lot of this work in our housing committee. And when Joanne and I went to hear her speak, we just knew that she would be appropriate to come and help us figure out what next steps or which way we can turn, how we can make this situation better. So without further ado, Leah,
Yeah,
are you there? Okay.
I'm here. Can you hear
Attempt
me?
to put you.
All right. Thank you, Robbie. Thank you, Angela, and everybody for having me. I grew up in Santa Monica, so it's just like wonderful to be with you all and to know the work you're doing and to be a small part of it. I wish I could be there in person, but this is good, second best. So with that, as you heard, I co-authored this book, Just Action. It's filled with examples of what we can do to begin to redress and challenge and remedy racial segregation in our communities. So I'm going to go into some examples from that book. Obviously, I can't get through many of them in a short amount of time, but we'll leave a lot of time for questions and answers. First, I'm going to give sort of more context setting about how the book came to be and sort of what we're hoping the impact will be of this work around the country. Some of it will likely be old news to a lot of you, but I think it's important to just sort of set the context of what we're talking about. So we all know that we live in a racially segregated society. You just heard the report from LA about how segregated the county is. This is true all across the country. It's not a surprise to any of us. Every metropolitan area is segregated by race. The segregation and separation of African Americans and whites in particular has been consistent and has not changed much even since the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. Black-white segregation has remained about the same. The gap in home ownership rates between whites and blacks has also not changed since the Fair Housing Act has passed. It remains a very large gap. The resulting wealth gap that exists between African Americans and whites also staggering. This wealth gap is due primarily to the fact that whites have accumulated wealth over generations through the ability to own homes and accumulate wealth through the increasing value of those homes. They were subsidized, allowed and subsidized by the federal government to get into home ownership when homes were affordable, while African Americans were prohibited from doing the same. So the result is that we live in a society now where whites have average household wealth for whites. Average household wealth for African Americans is about 5% of average household wealth for whites. It's a huge gap. It means that when you go to buy a house, if you don't have intergenerational wealth handed down to you to help pay for that down payment, it's very difficult, especially in the housing market we're in today, to be able to buy a home at all. So it's not surprising we have that home ownership gap between blacks and whites, given the wealth gap that we have. So that wealth gap, the home ownership gap, all of these disparities, racial disparities and racial inequities come down to the segregation of our communities. So we can see that the segregation of people is not a benign sort of segregation where some people live in one part of a city and some people live in another. It's also a separation of resources where some communities have access to more resources than others, and that's a racialized disparity. And it leads to disparities, as we heard in the report from the LA State of Black Los Angeles, leads to disparities in health outcomes, life expectancy, income outcomes, educational outcomes, contact with the criminal justice system. Sort of the quality and indeed the length of our lives are determined by the neighborhoods we live in. So when we talk about racial segregation, we're talking about something that affects all aspects of our lives and our lives themselves. So it's something that deserves our attention. We also understand, and I know you all do, from the history that is being sort of re-remembered about Santa Monica and the Civic Center and the eminent domain and displacement that happened with the African American community there, that the explanation that the country has about why we're a segregated country, that it was a de facto form of segregation. So this is sort of our collective myth that we've adopted for why we're a segregated country, that a de facto form of segregation means it happened by personal preference, that we like to live around people who look like us, and so that's why we sort of self-sorted into same race neighborhoods, or it was a result of private action or private actors, realtors, landlords, mortgage brokers, banks who refuse to sell or rent or give mortgages to African Americans to buy into white neighborhoods. And so that's why we're racially segregated. The de facto segregation idea doesn't put any responsibility for this segregation on the government and on our public policies and governmental actions. And as The Color of Law, my dad's book that came out in 2017, shows in great detail, this de facto segregation idea is just nonsense. It's a myth. It has never been true. We sort of collectively forgot about how intentionally and explicitly the government created segregated communities, but it doesn't change the fact that that's how we came to be segregated. It was intentional, explicit action by the federal, state, and local governments, government at all levels, to ensure that Blacks and whites lived apart from each other. So created, maintained segregated communities that then created and maintained the racial disparities that we live with. So understanding this history as is happening in Santa Monica and elsewhere around the country is important. Once we reckon with the truth that it was government action that created segregation, we can see that we have an obligation to do something about it. Because when our government takes unconstitutional action, we then, once we reckon with that truth, have an obligation to remedy those unconstitutional acts. So in Just Action, we attempt to answer how we can begin to do that. We sort of start by just setting the context that this is an obligation we all have as residents, citizens of the United States, to remedy this past and to challenge and undo and repair the segregation that has been created by our government. We argue in Just Action that to live up to this obligation, we need an activated civil rights movement around the country, local groups like yours and communities like yours, working on these issues locally to begin to enact the changes we need to see. Now, it might seem like we're on our way to building a new activated civil rights movement. 2020, we had a racial reckoning in the country. 20 million people across the country marched in Black Lives Matter demonstrations. It's a lot of people, more people than have marched in racial justice demonstrations than any time in our country's history. They were people of all races and ethnicities, all ages. They were from urban, suburban, rural areas. But then a lot of those people went home. They put lawn signs on their front lawns. They maybe went back to their companies and wrote letters to their shareholders denouncing racism, promising to do better. Maybe they hired diversity, equity, and inclusion officers, but they didn't then take the actions needed to actually change the causes and consequences of our segregated communities. One reason we think is that many people didn't know what to do about it. I have a background in housing policy and community organizing. When I read The Color of Law and listened to my dad lecture about it, I felt the call to action, this obligation to do something about it, but didn't know what to do. And I asked him, what is it we can do now? It feels like, segregation is just a way we are as a country, and there's sort of nothing we can do to make change about it. So when I asked him what we can do to challenge segregation, he challenged me to help him write this book to answer that question. So we attempt to give so many options and ideas of what we can do locally that sort of nobody has an excuse anymore to do nothing. Now, I know I'm speaking to the choir now. You all have started this group. You're working on these issues. You're building the relationships that we need to be able to, enact and advocate for these changes. And I love being a part of these groups and knowing, or, visiting, talking to you and hearing what you're doing. And I'll just add that this is happening all over the country. So it is, starting this sort of a bubbling up of these issues and these topics in communities, all kinds of communities all over the country. Not that we're not facing obstacles in achieving our goals, but but the first step is starting to work on them. So what we focus on in Just Action is the actions and policy changes we can work on locally in our own communities. You know, we understand that the federal government had a major role to play in creating segregation, but once created, local government, local policies, local programs are a primary driver of maintaining and perpetuating that segregation. So there's a lot that can be changed on the local level that will go a long way towards challenging and undoing that segregation. We also understand that we'll need federal policy change and massive interventions and investments to really challenge these issues and change the landscape of our cities and towns across the country. But, you know, we don't have that political will on the federal level to enact these kinds of changes right now. But we can build that political will locally. We can make meaningful changes on the local level that can then bubble up to national change. So to do this, we need to do what you're doing, which is start biracial, multi-ethnic committees in our own communities. And we give some examples in the book of communities that have done what you're doing. And, you know, we acknowledge that it can be hard work because we live in segregated communities, so we don't necessarily come into social contact naturally with people of other races. So it takes some intentional effort, which I'm sure you're all well aware of. But there's communities around the country doing that, some through churches, bringing people from congregations from different sides of town, but the same denomination, to come together and talk about racial issues, racial equity, and the history of how their communities came to look the way they do. Oftentimes, these groups start by educating their community about how they came to be segregated. You know, a lot of what I see coming out of Santa Monica is this, you know, sort of resurfacing the story of how the African American community was decimated in Santa Monica and what the impact of that has been. So communities around the country are doing similar educational work. Oftentimes this starts when homeowners discover a racially restrictive covenant on the deed of their own home. So these covenants were a primary tool of the federal government in the 20th century, mid-20th century. They're how the federal government kept African Americans out of home ownership, out of homes. They were written into the deeds of homes that the government helped to subsidize building. They said the home could only ever be owned or occupied by whites. So it was written into the deed. The segregation was that intentional and that explicit that it was written into the deeds of the homes that the federal government helped to build. And, you know, those covenants are no longer legally enforceable, but they remain on the deeds of homes forever. It's like the property line. They don't just go away. It's part of the legal documentation of that property. So homeowners discover these covenants on the deeds of their own homes and they become shocked. You know, they're shocked to see how intentionally their own community, their own home was segregated. And they've developed educational campaigns, inventories to show how prevalent this was. In Washington state, they've had volunteers inventory over 50,000 covenants around the state. We write about in our book in Modesto, California, a school teacher discovered a restrictive covenant on the deed of her home and then developed a program where high school students helped to do research through the county clerk's office to document all of the covenants in the community. And they created maps and overlaid those maps with the racial makeup of the neighborhoods of that community and used that to educate the community about how intentional the segregation, you know, that their community doesn't look the way it does by accident or by happenstance, that it was intentionally created that way. Once we see how intentionally our communities were segregated, we can start to see that intentional action can begin to do something to undo and challenge it. So that's why this educational piece is an essential first step kind of to getting people to action and to understanding our obligation to do something about it. And also that there is actually an opportunity to do something about it. Intentional action created it. Intentional action can begin to undo it. So there's so many things that we can do, like I said, locally to begin to challenge and redress segregation in our communities. There are things that have real impacts. I'll just start before I get into some examples. Oftentimes I get questions where people want to know what's the one thing, the most important thing. If I had to choose one strategy, what would it be? And I know it's a dissatisfying answer, but there isn't one thing. I think we're mistaken if we think that there's a silver bullet or a best answer, because there were so many policy and programmatic efforts and actions that went into creating segregation, there's going to be just as many that have to go into undoing it. So there isn't going to be one perfect solution. We're going to need many, many good solutions to begin to undo it. So I'll describe some, and happy to talk about more in the Q&A. And there's obviously more in our book and more. We're writing a Substack column where we're continuing to write about those issues, so I can make sure you all get information for how to follow us there. So the strategies that we discuss, they do two things. We call that, we use the term redressing segregation to cover these two goals. One is to ensure, looking to the future, that we don't continue to perpetuate and maintain segregated communities. So doing what we have to do to ensure that we change the policies that continue to maintain segregation going forward. And we also have to look to the past. We have to address the disparities that exist, the consequences of segregation. We can't remedy segregation without addressing the disparities that exist. We can't, like the Fair Housing Act, passed in 1968, it said we can no longer discriminate in the sale and rental of housing. That's a good thing. That's looking forward, ensuring that we can't no longer explicitly racially discriminate in the sale and rental of housing. But it doesn't do anything to address the wealth gap that I talked about. So it's one thing to say anyone can buy this house when African Americans have 5% of the wealth of white families. That home is inaccessible to them. So we have to address those disparities to truly remedy segregation and its consequences. So then we group the strategies we talk about into two categories. One are what are called place-based strategies. They're concerned with increasing investments and resources in lower income segregated African American communities, where the concentration of poverty is a direct result of government sponsored segregation. So a consequence of segregation of those communities is that they lack resources. And so we want to make those, as a remedy, and to redress segregation, make those neighborhoods areas of higher opportunity and more investment, more resources. Now, we likely all are familiar with what happens when a lower income community starts to see an increase in investment. People with higher incomes then are drawn to that community and move in, and gentrification occurs, and the longtime residents of that community are displaced and don't get to benefit from the increase in investment there. So we believe that some of that is inevitable. When you increase investment in a lower income community, there is some change that's going to happen. So you need to, rather than not increase investment to avoid that change, couple those strategies of increasing investment with strategies that can prevent some of the displacement that will occur. So protections for renters against rapidly increasing rents. So landlords in gentrifying areas, when they see the opportunity to get higher paying tenants in, they might jack up rents. They might come up with pretenses for evicting their tenants. So we need renter protections for the rent amount, and also against unjust evictions. So through just cause eviction ordinances, some cities are passing programs that ensure that every lower income tenant that's faced with an eviction has a free right to an attorney. So a right to counsel program that goes a long way to helping ensure that those residents can stay in their apartments, or at least avoid having an eviction on their record. And then inclusionary zoning is another important policy for this. It's a locally adopted policy that requires that when new housing is built, that a certain percentage of the units have to be maintained as affordable for lower and moderate income households. So ensuring that as new housing is developed in a gentrifying area, some of it will remain affordable. Another strategy is using the power that community groups have under the Community Reinvestment Act to pressure banks and make sure that they live up to their obligation to invest in the lower income communities in their service areas to the same extent they invest in the higher income communities. So this is, I can get into more detail about this if you're interested in that one. And then, so that's the first category of strategies we talk about. The other category are what are called mobility strategies, and they're concerned with opening up exclusive, often predominantly white, expensive, often suburban communities to diverse residents. These are communities that have prohibited African Americans from living in them historically, and they sort of do so now less explicitly through things like single family only zoning, ensuring that only large single family homes are built can be built in a community as a way of ensuring that the home prices in that community will remain high and pricing out anyone but the most affluent, often white residents. So desegregating those suburbs, some of those strategies are like zoning reform, subsidies for African Americans to live in those homes, both home ownership and rental subsidies, housing production, building more housing in these communities and ensuring that they're diverse type and affordability range of housing. So not only large single family homes, but duplexes, triplexes, smaller homes as well. And housing that's not just affordable to the affluent who can afford market rate housing or the very low income who qualify for subsidized low income housing, but also for what's called the missing middle. So most African Americans are not low income and so don't qualify for subsidized low income housing. And so we need to, if we want to desegregate these suburbs, also be concerned with building middle income housing in these areas. Also ensuring that the Section 8 or Housing Choice Voucher Program is a better opportunity for lower income tenants to use those vouchers to move to higher opportunity, higher cost areas. There's a lot of obstacles built into the program itself that are under local control by the local public housing authority that make it impossible for lower income tenants who use a housing choice voucher to help pay their rent. It makes it impossible for them to move out of high poverty areas. So I'm giving like an overview of a lot of these, and I know I'm probably just sparking a lot of questions, but I'm going to get into a little more detail about a couple more examples in a second. So another sort of category we talk about are strategies that reduce the obstacles to home ownership for African Americans in any type of community. So whether they're buying homes in a lower income segregated community or a segregated white expensive community, we want to reduce the obstacles to home ownership that African Americans face, and then also address the ways that wealth building is, the wealth building potential in home ownership is limited for African Americans compared to whites. So we often think of improving home ownership for African Americans as the answer for addressing the wealth gap, segregation, a lot of racial disparities and inequities. But when in reality, home ownership for whites is a better vehicle for wealth building than it is for African Americans. So there are benefits for increasing home ownership for African Americans. There's many benefits, but there's also a lot of obstacles that make it less beneficial than it is for whites. And so we need to address those obstacles as well. Some of those include disparities in property taxes that African Americans pay compared to whites, insurance disparities, things like that. So those are all, we need to address all of those obstacles if we're truly going to redress the causes and consequences of segregation. So I'll get into more detail about this one example for a minute. And that is one that accomplishes a lot of these goals. It sort of spans all of these. And that's a community land trust. So there are over 300 communities around the country that has a community land trust. I don't know that there's one in Santa Monica. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but they're usually a nonprofit organization. They usually have board representation from people in the community, in the land trust homes, and professionals in the housing or legal professions. So a land trust, their goal is to maintain affordable housing in a community where prices are rising. So gentrifying communities, for example. So creating and maintaining affordable housing and affordable home ownership opportunities in those communities. A land trust can also be a great way of creating affordable home ownership opportunities in like suburban communities for families who've historically been excluded from those communities. So how a land trust does this is a trust acquires property, usually through donation from a city or local government that has surplus unused land, sort of like the Civic Center in Santa Monica. And there's communities all over the country that have vacant land. We didn't write about Santa Monica and the Civic Center, but We wrote about Modesto, California, where the local government owns a vacant golf course that went out of business, or Woodbridge, Connecticut, where they own a vacant country club that went out of business. So these are communities all across the country that have these large pieces of vacant land and could donate a portion of those to a land trust. So a land trust, when it acquires land, it then builds or rehabilitates the homes on the land and sells those homes at affordable prices to lower and moderate income homeowners. And it can sell the home at an affordable price because in the sale, the land trust retains ownership of the land underneath the house and just sells the house on top of it. So one of the primary drivers of increasing unaffordability of housing, so one of the reasons why housing costs rise so quickly is because land costs are rising so quickly. So when you take the cost of land out of the equation, the house can be more affordable. So the homeowners, they own the home like any other homeowner. They pay their property taxes, insurance, mortgage interest, and principal. And then when they go to want to resell their home, they agree to adhere to a maximum resale price that the land trust establishes. So it's called a limited equity provision. So the homeowner, when they sell the home, the equity they can build in selling that home is limited. The land trust establishes an equation, says what the maximum resale price can be. And that equation, it balances the goals of allowing the home selling family to earn some equity. It's a limited amount of equity, but they can earn some. And because that has to be balanced with the competing goal of keeping the home affordable to the next home buying family. So when it strikes that balance in an effective way, these homes are permanently affordable homes in communities where land prices are rising really rapidly. So it's a great model. It's not the perfect model. Like I said, there is no one perfect answer, and I'll get into some reasons for that in a minute, but it's a great model that a lot of communities are using it. They're sort of taking off around the country now. We wrote about in Just Action, the Durham Land Trust in Durham, North Carolina. It started when a group of neighbors in a predominantly African-American lower income neighborhood in Durham started going door to door and talking to each other about what they could do to improve conditions in their neighborhood. The first thing they did was they decided they wanted to advocate that the city turn a vacant lot into their neighborhood into a park, because there were no parks in their area and kids were playing in the street, and a child was hit by a car. So they wanted to provide a safe place for kids to play. The city had promised to build this park and hadn't fulfilled on that promise. So the neighbors organized and advocated for this park, and they won. They got the park, and they were galvanized, excited, and looking around to see what else they could do to improve their neighborhood. And their neighborhood was gentrifying at the time. They're near Duke University, which was expanding. So investors were buying up the homes and displacing residents. So the land trust, this group learned about the land trust model and started one. And it started with 2 vacant homes that the city donated. And the first buyers of those homes paid $100,000 in today's money, which is a pretty affordable home. And the land trust homes, they now sell for about $150,000. So we can see how that equation that they use for the maximum resale price, it drives up the cost sum so that the home sellers can earn equity in those sales. But it's still, compared to the other homes in the neighborhood that now sell for $500,000, $150,000 is pretty affordable. So they've really maintained some affordability in that neighborhood. It's also been an effective anti-displacement strategy. The blocks where the land trust has been able to acquire homes, they now own over 300 properties, own or manage all across Durham, rental and home ownership. And in the blocks in this neighborhood where they began, where they were able to buy up homes and sell them at affordable prices, most of the residents are still African-American, while in the surrounding blocks where investors outpace the land trust, most of the residents are white. So it's an effective anti-displacement strategy, effective strategy for creating long-term affordability in this neighborhood. So what I say across the country to groups like yours is, with this example, we can help start a land trust in our own community. We can support one if it already exists, personally, with our own time and resources. But most importantly, what we can do collectively, and that is ensure that if a land trust doesn't exist, help to start one, and then ensure that our local governments and institutions support a land trust by donating vacant land and helping a land trust acquire more property. Now, there's a lot of opportunity in Santa Monica for that. It could be a great, even just a piece of that civic center land going to a land trust could create some great housing opportunities, home ownership opportunities. And then going a step further and ensuring that it's truly a strategy to redress the segregation of Santa Monica is putting a priority or a preference on those units built for the descendants of families displaced, for example, from building that civic center to begin with. So I mentioned that a land trust might not always be the perfect solution, and that is because of the limited equity arrangement in a land trust. So often, when we talk about addressing this wealth gap and we talk about getting African Americans into home ownership to help them build wealth, well, in a limited equity arrangement, they can't build up as much wealth as they could in buying a home on the market and sort of getting to benefit from all of the value accumulation of that home as it accumulates. So in a land trust home, a homeowner doesn't get to benefit from all of that wealth accumulation. It still helps. It still is a beneficial program, and communities, and homeowners do like the land trust model. But it's not the only one, because if we want to address this wealth gap, we need to sort of look at it a different way. So as I mentioned before, primary reason for the wealth gap between whites and African Americans is the policy in the 20th century of the federal government to subsidize whites into home ownership when homes were affordable, subsidize not only the homeowners, but the developers who built the homes, and then put those restrictive covenants on the homes, ensuring that only whites could buy them. So whites then could get into home ownership when it was affordable and build up wealth over generations as those homes increased in value, while African Americans were explicitly excluded from building up wealth the same way. So, homes, when the federal government was subsidizing the suburbanization of the country and subsidizing whites to buy into those homes were about $100,000 in today's money. Again, a very affordable price for a home. Homes in suburbs that the federal government helped to create, or in communities anywhere in California, don't sell for $100,000. They sell for far more than that, 300, 400, 500, over $1 million. And so the whites who inherited wealth, by this accumulation in value, they could help their kids buy homes. They could, weather health emergencies and help enjoy their retirement. But the most important piece was that helping their children buy homes and bequeathing that wealth to help them get into home ownership when they wanted to. African Americans, again, explicitly prohibited from doing the same. So if we want to address this wealth gap, and we can see how government policy helped to create it, so we can see that there is a remedy due for that government policy, then we need to do, there's a couple of things we could do. We could either bring down the prices of homes for African Americans to the level that they were when Blacks were prohibited from buying them, so subsidize the price of homes, or we could subsidize the homeowners to help them get into home ownership. So providing down payment, closing cost assistance. Whites far more often get this kind of help from their families, from intergenerational wealth, to help pay for those down payments, that African Americans don't have access to the same wealth. So even if they have the same incomes and can pay the same mortgage amount, they can't pay the down payment. And so that's a big obstacle to getting into home ownership. So we talk about some ways that communities are addressing this. We profile in Just Action a couple of individuals and companies that have created down payment assistance grant programs targeted to African American and Latino home buyers. So they raise money from corporations, from institutions in their community, from realtor associations, for example, and from individuals, and then grant that money to home buyers who are African American or Latino to help address this wealth gap that exists. We wrote about one in Pasadena, actually. It's called the Green Lining Housing Foundation. They started a couple of years ago. They're expanding into other cities. It's a great model for, living up to our obligation on a very real level of addressing the disparities that exist because of government policy. Now, we discuss in Just Action ways that we can do this, and not only through, individual donations or bank programs or governmental down payment assistance programs, but also identifying the institutions and companies in our own communities that help to create segregation when segregation was created. Often these companies are named on those deeds that have the restrictive covenants. So the deed will name the bank that first financed the home, the realtor that first sold it, the developer and the builder that first built it. And oftentimes, even though it was a while ago, those companies are still in business in our communities. And if they aren't in business, they've been acquired by another company that is in business. So we investigated some of these restrictive covenants in Charlottesville, Virginia. And all of those four, the bank, the developer, the builder, the realtor, they were, most of them, still in business in Charlottesville, or had been acquired by a company that is. And most of those companies had put some statement on their website in or near 2020 saying that they denounce racial disparities and racism, and that they, were going to do something to address it. Now, this is a way a community group that's organized around the redress of segregation could get these companies to live up to those statements and actually contribute to remedies for the segregation that they helped to create. And one way they could do that is by funding a down payment assistance program, for example. Another approach is something that isn't in Just Action because it happened since we wrote the book, but in Washington State, they recently, I think in April, passed the Covenant Home Ownership Act. And it was based on an organizing effort by a broad coalition around the state, and also a research effort to identify those 50,000 racially restrictive covenants all over the state. Volunteers helped do this. So based on that history, the state has authorized adopting what's called a special purpose credit program. This is an authority given to financial institutions to create a race-based financial benefit. So either a grant, a down payment assistance grant or loan program, or a favorable mortgage that can be race-based. Now, there's no other, authority to do that. Being specific about race is generally not allowed. But under this authority, a special purpose credit program, if an entity, a bank, or in this case, the government, can show that this racial group has been discriminated against by the financial industry, and as a result has limited access to credit in this community, then they can create a race-based solution. So Washington State is undergoing a study to identify all of the ways that the government has discriminated against and kept African Americans and other people of color out of home ownership. And to address that, to remedy that, they're creating a down payment and closing cost assistance program for people who were discriminated against by these racially restrictive covenants and who either lived in Washington State before the passage of the Fair Housing Act or are descended from people who did. They're funding this program by a $100 fee applied to every real estate transaction in the state. So they're putting real money into it. $100 fee, when you're buying a house, it sort of gets lost in all the other fees. But together, of all the homes sold in the state, is going to create a significant source of funding for truly redressing the actions of the government. So there's a lot of other issues around this. Another obstacle to home ownership for African Americans is the credit scoring system. So this is an example of implicit, sort of not racially discriminatory. It's not racially discriminatory on its face, the credit scoring system, but it is racially discriminatory in its effect or in its impact. And here's why. So the credit scoring system we think of as an objective rating of our future likelihood of being able to repay a debt, like a mortgage. So if you have a high credit score, you're eligible for a mortgage. And if it's high enough, you'll get a lower interest rate. And it's based on your financial history. So it makes some kind of sense. If you've defaulted on loans in the past, a bank might not want to loan you money in the future. Some of that makes sense. but it's only based on a certain type of financial history. And it's a type of financial history that whites are far more likely to have than African Americans. African American neighborhoods of all income levels have fewer bank branches than similar economic level white neighborhoods. So with fewer bank branches, people in those neighborhoods have to rely on non-traditional financial institutions, payday lenders, for example. Payday lenders have exorbitant interest rates. Even if you pay back that interest rate in full, you pay your debt, that seems like a good indication that you're a good borrower. But that kind of financial history doesn't get factored into a credit score. So just by the neighborhood you live in and the access you have to credit already, it reduces your access to credit in the future. Another reason why African Americans have lower credit scores or harder, to access credit is because when you have had a mortgage in the past and you've paid that mortgage on time and you've made your payments every month, that financial history is factored into a credit score. But if you've been a renter your whole life, which African Americans, when they're applying for a mortgage, are more likely to have been renters in the past than whites applying for a mortgage. If you've been a renter your whole life, never missed a rent payment, never missed a utility bill payment, none of that is factored into your credit score. So this is why there's a racially disparate impact of this policy. So the result is that about 30% of African Americans have no credit score. So they just don't have the kind of financial history that would create a score at all. And that's compared to 17% of whites. And of those with a credit score, over half of whites have a credit score high enough to be eligible for a mortgage, compared to about a quarter of African Americans. So one way of addressing this is by just starting to factor in rental payment history into the algorithms for credit scoring. And this is something that's starting to happen on the federal level. There's some pilot programs federally, but this pilot program has been in the works for 15 years. So it's, a slow moving train, that one on the federal level. But we can work with our local financial institutions to get them to adopt a different underwriting standard to factor rental payment history into their calculations of who will be a good borrower. And we profile in Just Action a couple of credit unions and banks that are doing that locally. And it goes a long way to opening up credit access and mortgage access to African Americans. And so that's another important barrier that we can remove and something we can do locally about this. So I think I could talk forever about all of the examples in the book, but I'll stop to give time for discussion and questions. But I'll just say to wrap up that these are just a couple of examples. There's dozens more in the book. There's dozens more that we couldn't include in the book. I'm still learning about more sort of strategies and policies that community groups are advocating for around the country that are having real impacts and really making change around these issues. So the takeaway that I hope you all get is that there's a lot that can be done. This is an overwhelming problem. Segregation feels intractable, but it's not. We don't lack for options. There's a lot that can be done to begin to challenge and undo it. And like I said earlier, just like there were many pieces that went into creating it, there's going to be many pieces that go into undoing it. So we just have to get started somewhere, like you all are doing. So I hope this helps give a little more fuel to your fire. And I guess I'll open up to questions. I'm just going to turn the light on because it got very dark.
Oh, no worries. Thank you. And if you have questions, can you please either send a message if you're on virtual to either Janet or myself if you have questions, and that way we can ask them or acknowledge your hand raised. Robbie, I don't know if you have any questions right now, but I most certainly do. that I would like to start with, if that's okay. Did I see a thumbs up, Robbie or Joanne? Okay, so Leah, real quick, and thank you so much again for sharing your time this evening, and also for this very insightful book and the research that y'all have done. I have a couple of questions. I wanted real quick, because you mentioned the Community Reinvestment Act, right? And how it looks at banks and how they are reinvesting in the city, perhaps. I'm wondering, did you look in Santa Monica, or is there any type of research that's being done right now, if we can pull some type of, or let us know how we could get that information regarding which banks in Santa Monica has been in fact reinvesting in the community.
Yeah, so the Community Reinvestment Act, it's a
Mhm.
federal act that requires banks to invest in the lower and moderate income neighborhoods in their service area. So banks can't just say they service LA County and only service, Beverly Hills.
Right, right.
And so banks I'll just give some background for folks. So banks get a score. It's called a CRA score. They get rated on how well they're doing this. Now, the law, like many laws in these areas, have little teeth. So a bank with a bad score, nothing bad really happens to them. But banks are very concerned with their public perception. So a bad score does actually have some motivation for, they are motivated under the CRA to do better. This is why a lot of banks fund affordable housing, for example. It's because it helps in their CRA ratings. Now, when it really becomes important is when a bank wants to merge or acquire another bank, which happens a lot more often than we think. So when a bank wants to merge or acquire another bank, it has to go before federal regulators and get approval for that. And in that approval process, the federal regulators look at their CRA scores and they provide an opportunity for the public to comment on if this is a good deal for the community, basically. And there are a lot of communities who have organized in this particular sort of lever of power that the community has to hold up a merger or an acquisition, to put public pressure on a bank, to call out their bad practices, to file lawsuits, and pressure banks to improve their Community Reinvestment Act performance. And in return, if they do that, the community groups will stop sort of holding up this process. And this is a very effective way. Banks don't want to be held up in this process. It's very expensive for them. They don't want the bad publicity. So oftentimes they'll agree to a community benefit agreement in return for the community group to stop its opposition. And this happens all over the country. We do give some examples in the book of communities that have done this, not in Santa Monica. And I don't know of any in Santa Monica, but I'm sure it's happening. We do have a picture in the book of, actually, I think 2 pictures of community groups demonstrating in front of bank branches, one in San Francisco and one in New York. One was, both of these banks had poor Community Reinvestment Act ratings. They also had a practice of lending to landlords or property owners to buy apartment buildings based on a higher income from rent than they were currently getting. So basically these banks were underwriting gentrification. They're saying, we'll lend you money to buy this apartment building, knowing you're going to jack up the rents. And so community groups protested and they got some community benefits. Now, both of those banks, one was First Republic Bank and one was Signature Bank. They both have had a lot of problems lately. So the two things, that practice and their problems are not unrelated. But there is there's the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, NCRC, and the the California Community Reinvestment Coalition. And both of those groups are sort of watchdog groups and technical assistance around how to use the CRA and help local groups organize around this. And they also track when banks have CRA issues or mergers or acquisitions coming up. So those are good resources for seeing what's happening locally. The California Community Reinvestment Coalition probably knows something about what's happening in Santa Monica.
Oh, thank you for that. And I just had one more question and then I'll go back to Robbie and Joanne. So you also mentioned regarding the Covenant Home Ownership Act.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, is there any kind of way that, like, I don't know how those algorithms work, perhaps for the 50,000 homes that have been detected so far, but is there a way that we would know that for here in Santa Monica? Like, is there a way that they can track that? Folks are notified, like here are the properties that are on the list. How does that work?
Yeah, it's usually it takes just research because it's in these old documents. People go, so in Modesto, it was high school students went to the clerk's office and looked through all the property records. In Charlottesville, they had a crowdsourced program where they could look at the deeds online, and volunteers were trained to do this, and they could flag the deed as being racially restrictive. And if 5 volunteers flagged a deed as racially restrictive, it would go into the inventory. So there's creative ways that people have done it, but it is just some inventorying work. I believe California as a state has passed some law to make it easier to investigate these restrictive covenants and inventory them. I can't remember if it's funding or requiring clerks to digitize or look at the deeds. Important work. It's important that we understand where this is. In a lot of communities, this work, then the next step community groups take is putting a lot of effort into erasing these restrictive covenants on the deeds, which is understandable. It's an offensive history. We don't necessarily want to look at it on our deeds. But the sort of counter to that is if we don't see them there, if we don't see the evidence of how we came to be a segregated society, we don't see that we have an obligation to do something to fix it. We also don't see what we can do because we think it sort of feeds into this idea that it happened by accident. If we erase all of the evidence of how we truly came to look like we do as a country. So we have some opinions about or erasing this history, and I think it's Marin County, instead of sort of redacting or erasing it, they put a statement stapled on top of the deed saying, we as a community, don't believe in the motivations behind whatever the words they use, saying like, we don't agree with these deeds. That's great too, but Marin County has a lot to do in actually desegregating their county and creating affordable housing and allowing more non-white people to live there. So just stapling that statement isn't, the end of their obligation. So it's sort of a mixed bag. It's important that we know that they're there. It's important to do something about it once we do, but what we do has to have real impacts, or it's just sort of symbolic.
Thank you for that. And I believe Joanne and Robbie have some questions from the general audience that's there. But thank you so much, Leah.
Thanks.
I'll hold my questions.
Okay.
Okay, before we go into our Q&A here, where we were supposed to start with our Q&A with the people who came in person, we weren't overlooking you. This is how we do this. I know Audrey says shame, Angela. This is how we count off in up to 5. And so what we're going to ask is that you come up here so that the owl can recognize you and you will show up so Leah can see you. But before we do that, I want to say, number 1, let's give Leah a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. It's amazing.
Robbie, we can't see you, but okay. I need you to step back. Can you step back? No, the other way. Yeah.
Or sit down. Or you can sit down.
Yeah.
Okay, so can you see me now?
Yes. Yes. Stay right there.
Mr. Owl, can you find me?
There you go. That's good.
So we're gonna ask that people come and stand where I am so that they can see you, and so you guys can line up right here and we'll come off in 5s. But I want to say also, Leah said something about symbolization. We all, I don't know, most of you may know that the city of Santa Monica, the council is coming upon in 1 year that they formally given an apology to the African American community for all of the things that were done to them here in Santa Monica. And we have asked for a few action items, and I guess, we haven't really gotten to that after a whole year. But what I also want to say is, to me, and I don't know how you guys feel about it, but if that is a priority, I really feel some kind of way because I don't see any council members online or here to hear this information. So I like to ask you guys, if you feel like I do, maybe you might want to drop a note, a letter to your council members and ask them to look at the video because it is recorded. And just, see if they can't kind of get involved and figure out how they can do some of the things that Leah talked about. So that's number one. Number two is, you see how powerful we are? She kept saying community groups and what we have the power to do. So I want y'all to get your friends, bring them to CRJ. We have a housing committee. Bring them to our housing committee because we're working on these issues right now as we speak. We're working on them. So we need all of you guys. We need your help. So let's get going. Let's get going. So questions. Who has questions? Craig, come on up. That smile. Okay, here, I know you don't need the mic, right? Do you want it? You want it?
It really doesn't matter
Okay,
to me.
okay, go ahead, so that I can see you right here, they can see you right
You see me right here?
Uh-huh.
You know, keeping hot on what Robbie said, I am most impressed about your father's book. And in looking at your father's book, we saw some things clearly that Santa Monica was a part of. And in mentioning the Black apology, it's an admission that indeed people were done wrong. So my question now to you becomes, in the way of strategy, because a lot of this, in terms of these policymakers, is attitude and ideological. So my question to you is, what do you find as effective in terms of strategy to address not just the fact that there's not any real movement towards making us whole, but long-term, how it is we can more or less leverage that goodwill that was seen to have happened a year ago into making some active change and to where we can benefit from it, as we were traumatized of it.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that question. I think it's up to all of us to hold our elected officials' feet to the fire, to ensure that when they issue an apology, that it's not an empty promise or just a symbolic statement, but that they put some money behind it and take some action to actually make that apology a real thing. And, this is happening all over the place. There's a lot of apologies going around, and then there's a lot that has to be done to turn that into actionable change. And I'll just say that, my dad's book, The Color of Law, was very impactful. It had this surprising readership and impact on the country. And I think it contributed to the levels of conversations we're having now, even just the apologies coming out of city governments or state or the National Realtors Association, for example. There is some more acknowledgement of the roles that government and institutions have played in creating segregation and discriminating. And so this is it's an example of the slow process of changing, sort of educating all of us and the voting public to make sure that we understand the true history of how we got here and the obligation we have to do something about it. And so I think that it is a slow moving wheel, but a lot has been moving lately over the last few years. And, it's up to all politicians, policymakers. It's sort of easy for them to issue an apology. It's hard for them to do something about it. So they're not going to do it unless we make sure that they do.
As a brief follow-up, would you say that, you know, taking out a full page ad in the daily paper, you know, calling them out would be out of bounds in this respect?
I don't think it would be out of bounds. No. Yeah, I think there's a lot of strategy. I think getting more people involved, having, you know, grassroots organizing efforts, electing officials who agree with what we're talking about. Sort of, I can't say what the most effective strategy would be, but I don't think a public messaging campaign would shouldn't be one of them. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Any other questions right now? Okay, so our group doesn't have any more. Angela, do you have any online? But before we do that, I just want to say and acknowledge that our city manager is online. And they are preparing to do some listening sessions. The only problem I have with that is that CRJ, along with Community Corporation, has already done listening sessions. I mean, we've done surveys and all of it. That's how we came up with the action items. So to just repeat, Leah, seems to me like stalling a little bit. I mean, I know they can say we are not the entire community. However, they wrote the apology with just, you know, with CRJ telling them that we had our surveys and we had done the work. And so they signed off on it. And now they're redoing what we already have kind of done without even starting to do the first thing of low-hanging fruit that we had asked for, to do some items that don't cost any money at all. So I just wanted to put that out there that yes, they are starting to, you know, setting up to do listening sessions. You know, kind of ignoring the fact that we've kind of already done that. So Joanne has a question.
Hi, yes, we have, the housing committee has looked at a number of things. One of them is Section 8. And we know that there are Black folks who have Section 8 vouchers and they cannot use them in Santa Monica. It's like they can't find a landlord that will take them. So have you seen communities have success with trying to get that? I mean, it's against the law, discrimination. Have you seen communities have success trying to address it?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So I'll again give a little background. So Section 8 housing, rental housing voucher for lower income families. And it's supposed to give lower income families the opportunity to live in higher cost areas, to leave high poverty neighborhoods, live in places like Santa Monica, because it's a voucher that is portable, it's mobile, you can use it anywhere in the jurisdiction of the housing authority. There's a lot of reasons why only 5% of voucher holders live in what are called high opportunity areas, so high resource, well-resourced schools, healthy air, sort of all of these indicators for a high opportunity area. And white Section 8 voucher holders are more likely to live in these areas than African Americans are. There's a lot of reasons. One is discrimination, like you mentioned. It's an allowed form of discrimination on the federal level to discriminate against tenants because they use Section 8 or housing choice vouchers to pay their rent. It's not legal in California. There's a source of income discrimination law on the books. But like many anti-discrimination laws, it's only as effective as its enforcement and monitoring. So as you can see in Santa Monica, a lot of landlords in places where there are these anti-discrimination laws still discriminate. They still say no Section 8, or they find other ways to discriminate against and ensure they don't rent their units to people using Section 8 vouchers. That is illegal to do. So we have to get out there and find where this is happening. And this work often falls to civil rights organizations or fair housing organizations. They need our support to do the work. One way we could support them individually is by volunteering to be a tester. So fair housing organizations, when they find where discrimination is occurring, is they send testers out to apply for a unit. Some are white, some are African American. Some say they use Section 8 and some don't. You know, otherwise they're similar in qualifications. you can see how they're treated. Some prospective tenants will be shown the unit, and some might be told it's already rented, even when it's not. That's the only way to really find out where discrimination is occurring. And then those fair housing centers can prosecute those actions. They can only do that with volunteers to do the testing. So that's something we could do to help. There's also another factor of the Section 8 program, which is how the Section 8 benefit is calculated. That is a greatly limiting factor to being able to live in higher opportunity areas. So the Section 8 voucher amount, when you get a Section 8 voucher, you pay 30% of your monthly income towards your rent, no matter what your income is, and the voucher pays the rest up to a maximum amount. That maximum amount is set based on the median rent of the whole metropolitan area. So the LA metro area, as we know, is huge with rents that span from low to very, very high. You take the middle of all of those rents, 10% below that is the maximum rent a voucher will pay. So by definition, 60% of the rents in the LA metropolitan area are too expensive for voucher holders to afford. So it's not surprising that they can't use their vouchers to live in Santa Monica. Those are likely rental rates that are above the maximum voucher amount. So there is a change in the voucher program that some metro areas and public housing authorities are required to do, which is use a smaller area to calculate the maximum voucher amount. So use a zip code or a group of zip codes. So in higher cost areas of the metro area, a voucher would pay more than in lower cost areas, which is a logical sort of solution. 24 metropolitan areas are required to do that around the country. Los Angeles is not one of them. And so outside of those 24 metropolitan areas, local public housing authorities can adopt these, they're called small area fair market rent standards. Local public housing authorities can adopt it voluntarily, can agree to adjust their maximum voucher amount based on the median rent of that small area in their metro region. And I've talked to several housing authorities that have done this. So again, this takes advocacy, local groups advocating that the housing authority do this. It's something that they have the authority to do, and it allows for a lot more mobility for voucher holding tenants. There's a lot of other obstacles too to voucher holders being able to move to places like Santa Monica. We need to educate landlords, dispel the myths they have about Section 8 tenants. We've talked to landlords around the country who prefer to rent to Section 8 tenants because they're more stable and they take better care of the properties. And that's just not what many landlords think about the Section 8 program. So dispelling those myths, there's some localities that have sort of incentive programs to landlords that rent to voucher holders to help make this more possible, these mobility moves. There's also things, if you get involved in this issue and look at what the obstacles are to landlords participating in the voucher program in your area, sometimes there's just bureaucratic hurdles that landlords don't want to have to go through. So that can be an easy lift for a housing authority to change, that like adopting an electronic signature program instead of requiring landlords to come in and sign papers might help make it easier for landlords to rent to Section 8 tenants. You know, talking to people we know that are landlords and asking if they are open to renting to Section 8 tenants. And, you know, a lot of this, again, is sort of talking to our neighbors and being active members of our communities, as you all are, and talking about these sort of intricate issues that affect our communities. And so working on it sort of on the collective big scale and on the individual one-on-one scale is important.
Okay, Angela, what you got online?
I'm going to call Dr. Michelle Wittig. Michelle, I believe you had a comment/question.
Oh, thanks so much. Yes. I've been a member of the board of the FAME Santa Monica Redevelopment Corporation since its inception about 15 years ago. That corporation built 49 units of very low income housing adjacent to the First AME Church and on Euclid Street. About 5 or 6 years ago, we received redevelopment grant money just before it was canceled during one of the recessions. My comment is really about the Santa Monica Airport. As most people in the city know, that airport will be the subject of some discussion, I think, at the Santa Monica Democratic Club very soon, and in City Council, I'm sure thereafter. It is 227 acres. That's 0.35 of a square mile. Our city is 8.4 square miles. So the airport is 4% of the landmass of Santa Monica. If we were to work to devote 1/4 of that 4% for low-income housing and other affordable housing strategies, that would be 1% of all of the landmass of Santa Monica. And I think that that's a reasonable goal. We should think strategically about advocating for that and work with others who have other ideas about how to use that airport land. Thanks.
Yes. Yeah, it's a great idea.
Thank you. And I'm looking to see if anyone else has their hand raised, as well as checking in the comment. I did have another question while we're waiting, because I know we're almost at time here. With respect to, where is it at? With respect to creating, I guess we could say, affordable apartments versus co-op housing, right? What, and I know you get pushback for both, but do you have any examples of something that is similar here to Santa Monica, where you did see some co-op housing actually come, manifest, so that there was this opportunity for home ownership? Do we have areas in California where that actually did happen? I guess I had another comment to that. You were talking about Marin County with their blanket statement, just being from the Bay Area. I know we'll never see that in Redwood City. I like your comment on that one too. But yeah. Do you have any comparisons where,
I mean, there are home ownership efforts for affordable home ownership. I know we have a photo in the book of a family in Petaluma that got into a condo that was actually an inclusionary zoning requirement. So a big market rate condo development in Petaluma had to set aside 10% or 15% as affordable. So a woman who's a paralegal for the city of Petaluma and was commuting from really far away, her and her daughter and grandchildren live with her in this condo that they were able to buy because it was an inclusionary unit. And that was interesting because the inclusionary requirement was by the city. So the developer had to build that unit and then deed it to a land trust, to the local land trust that managed the sale of that home. So then the land trust, again, retains sort of, it's complicated because it's a condo. So the land under the house is like a complicated legal thing, but they retain some, the ability to keep the affordability of that home when this woman wants to resell it. So it's not quite an answer to your question, but there are efforts to create affordable home ownership in expensive places. And it's an important strategy. We need to, it's sort of this missing middle question that I was talking about. The answer oftentimes when we talk about creating more affordable housing in expensive communities, the answer a lot of housing people go to is building low-income housing tax credit buildings, because that's the biggest source of funding for affordable housing. And they can get, federal tax credits to build that housing and a lot, layered financial assistance to build it. But those units are for very low income households, which is important. But we also need to create housing for the middle income who can't afford market rate housing and make too much to qualify for subsidized housing. So that's what this Petaluma example is a family like that. There's also, there's a lot of creative home ownership. The Section 8 program has the authority, local public housing authorities can use their Section 8 vouchers for home ownership. If they want, they can create a home ownership program in their Section 8 program where tenants or voucher recipients, instead of using their voucher to help pay their rent, they use the voucher to help pay a mortgage. So if we're talking about public benefits that don't just maintain the cycle of poverty and maintain the current status quo, using a public benefit to help a family get into home ownership and create wealth and stability that way is hugely important. And not a lot of housing authorities use this ability. It's more complicated. Their staff tends to know the rental market better than the home ownership market. There might not be homes affordable that voucher holders can qualify for. They have to work with banks who will qualify voucher holders using their voucher as part of their income. But it's not impossible. Here, I live in Oakland, and Oakland has done it. They've helped voucher tenants buy homes with their vouchers. And the idea is that they then eventually sort of taper off using the voucher and become, get off of the voucher program. So there's a lot of creative ways to address this issue in a lot of different ways. Yeah.
No, I think, and thank you for that, because that's an excellent point, Robbie. Think about that with respect to what's low-hanging fruit. If the city has to make requirements for builders, perhaps that's another portion of that would help the middle-income people like myself who can afford it, but it's just getting that 50,000 set aside. We have one more question, Robbie. I hope you don't mind. Hazur, I'm going to go back to you because you had a question, comment. So if you could. I think let me unmute you.
Okay, I just said, when repairing the harm done to Black Americans, many other so-called people of color like to sue for discrimination. How do we combat this? I know you talked a little bit about it, but that's my question.
That other people of color sue for the attention on African-American repair? Is that what you're referring to? Or
yeah, they sue and they say that it's discrimination, right?
Yeah. It's a great question. And I think we very specifically focus on the repair for African Americans because the policies that segregated and discriminated against African Americans were very explicitly targeted at that community, at African Americans, in a different way than other people of color have been harmed by policies. And we argue that if we want to repair, we have to be very specific about what we're repairing for. So we're repairing for policies that were explicitly harming African Americans, then the remedies have to explicitly benefit African Americans. We have to tie our solutions to the harms that we're intending to repair for. And so when we do that, we can see that the harm was race specific. It was specific to African Americans, so the repair has to be specific to African Americans. Now, that doesn't mean that other communities aren't due repair also. Certainly there should be repair for the Native American community, Latino community, but those are different repairs because different policies harmed them. And there is a danger in sort of fearing that pushback so much that we create these broad umbrellas that sort of benefit everybody and is too vague and too broad and not connected to the actual harm, that we can't then have a solution that's effective and meaningful. This is why the Washington State example, I think, is a great one, because it's connecting very explicitly to the harm that was caused. And I appreciate your question. I often get a lot of questions about, we can't be race specific at all in our solutions because we'll be sued for being in violation of civil rights laws and the Fair Housing Act. And again, if you lead with the harm that you're repairing for, that's how we can be race specific. And it does take some courage because there's going to be pushback from a lot of sides on this, but it's what's called for once we reckon with this history.
Man, that was an amazing question, Hazur. Hazur, thank you so much for asking that question. And Leah, thank you for answering it so perfectly, because that is what we've been getting in Santa Monica, that we really can't, we have to do for everyone. We can't specifically single out African American population because everybody else will be upset and possibly sue or whatever. And so you answered that. That made sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
I just hope that when council looks at this video, it makes sense to them and their staff or whoever is involved, because it's very, very important. It's been a long time coming. You know, African American people waited a very long time for all of this and have suffered quite a bit. I feel our ancestors that were here in this city prior to, I hope they're cheering because we've gotten to this point, because they certainly have tried. So, any more questions?
Over here.
Oh,
Did, yeah. I did, Robbie. I had one more that I'd like for Leah to touch on because she talked about this. Leah, you mentioned the difference between an ally and a co-conspirator, right? The ally will work and do a little bit with you, but then they're done and they sit down. But a co-conspirator will do what? Look at their deed, right? And try to make changes. Like, can you just answer that a little bit more? So for the co-conspirators that are on this call who are with CRJ, can you let them know what they can do?
Yeah, I mean, any of these things that we're talking about is something that we all have an obligation to do, to repair these harms that we all suffer from. We also, our society, all of us suffer from segregation and discrimination, obviously some more than others, but our society as a whole is limited by this history and our sort of inability or our refusal to really reckon with it and repair it. And so if we want to do that, we need to be do more than just talk about it, do more than it, put a lawn sign on our front lawn, and do more than even, do more than vote, because it takes a lot to push these issues forward. There's never been advances in civil rights or racial equality that hasn't come with obstacles and opposition. And so we all need to be doing this together. And, I think I didn't use the ally co-conspirator language, but I see like the difference. And I think we need a lot more co-conspirators. We also need a lot more allies. Everybody has a different role to play, and everybody needs to, we need the support from all sides. We need to be more activated, connected with each other, working on these issues in our own communities, and finding support where we can. Yeah.
Okay, we have one more question from the audience here.
Do you know anything about the downtown Crenshaw group in Los Angeles?
The downtown Crenshaw, what?
Group in Los Angeles. They were
No.
fighting for a long time to for land trust. Group started by Crenshaw Mall, and I think they failed on that. But they did buy another building. I think they're working on buying some housing in Lamar Park there. I just wondered if you'd heard about some areas in contact with.
I haven't, but I'll look into them. Yeah. I didn't know about them. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's great. Okay, before we assemble to close out, Leah, in Santa Monica, I think it was in the 90s. I don't know, somebody can correct me, Patricia, anybody online. So, the 80s and 90s, we had something called Torca. Yeah, and so where you could purchase your condo, the city was helping. Patricia, can you speak to that real quick?
I can. Unfortunately, the Torca program, which had great ideals of tenants being able to buy their units and live there forever, was an abject failure, because about 3% of the tenants who were offered their units were able to buy them, and about 10% bought units in their buildings, but not the units that they lived in at the time. And their right to buy and their protections as tenants expired after 2 years. If we did anything about a conversion to home ownership, it would have to be that the rights were vested for a lot longer than 2 years. So
yeah,
I could get you people who can go into greater detail than I, but it was not a successful program. And one of the columnists in the Daily Press owns a Torca unit that he did not live in when it converted. And so so there's a lot of really pro Torca, even though the program itself was a failure. But we can work on other kinds of programs. And also, since Robbie, you gave me the floor, I just want to say that one of the things that Community Corporation was looking at in terms of the Civic Center property was a land trust. And so anyhow, we're working on all those things, and thank you for asking me.
Yeah, it's great. I just want, it's unconscionable, I think, for Santa Monica to have that much land and not put housing on it.
Oh,
So-
Absolutely.
well, listen, thank you so much, Leah. Thank you, mommy, for
Hi, Mom.
Dad, for bringing this wonderful person into our, being able to have her in our lives is gonna be wonderful, because this is not our last rodeo with you, Leah. You know
Good.
that. So, or your mom, okay, who is a great activist herself. So if we can have everybody stand to your feet finally, this is how we close out at CRJ. We form a circle. And then you want to say?
I just want to say, I'm sorry that the people who are on Zoom couldn't see the beautiful people who are here in person tonight, but it's a miracle we got the technology. Oh, there they are, of course.
Yeah, we do the best we can. But listen, once we do the circle up here, guess what? I'm gonna take a quick photo shoot so we can see those online and those in the circle, you know, coming together. And then Angela will unmute everybody online as we do our closeout chant. Come on, let's form the circle, guys. Come on, man.
Hi, Mom.
Okay, that's great. Everybody unmuted, Angela?
Everybody unmute.
Except for Angela, you're still muted.
Oh, I know, but I'm still trying to just work through and make sure everybody else is okay.
Oh, there are people there. Good.
Oh, we can't hear.
Hollywood Bowl. So anyway, and then now here. So this is how we end this, and Craig is sort of gonna help me a lot.
Oh,
See, got this
God.
by,
Daria,
relative of
they're doing the close, but it's funny. So Craig's gonna help a lot because he.
So they're getting the family together. Hi, Daria. Okay, so it goes like this. It goes from, you know, I'll start off low, and you guys will repeat after me and call and response, and then I'll go a little higher. And then we want to say it so loud they hear it at City Hall. Okay.
No.
Yes, sir. I hear it too. So it goes like this. We have a duty to fight for freedom.
It is our duty to
We
fight.
have a duty to fight.
We need to fight for freedom.
We must love and protect one another.
We must love and protect
one another.
It is our duty to fight for freedom.
It is our duty to fight for freedom.
For freedom.
It is our duty to win.
It is our duty to win.
It is our duty to win.
One another.
We must
love one another.
But our change.
Nothing to lose but our chance.
Big flat foot. We're ready. It is our duty to fight for freedom.
It is our duty to fight for
Fight
freedom.
for freedom.
Freedom.
It's our duty to win.
It's our duty
It
to
is our
win.
duty to win.
Our duty to win.
We must love and protect each other.
We must love and protect each
So we
other.
protect each other.
Each other.
We have nothing
To lose but our chains.
But our chains.
Ashe.
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 You guys, thank you. Thank you
So-
so much, Leah.
Thank you.
Leah, just quickly, my number 3 son is working for the Public Welfare Foundation in Washington, DC. He's an abolitionist and he's really all the ban the box kind of activist.
Uh-huh.
So he was just asking me today about felons who can't rent anywhere and the disparate impact of that. So
Yeah, that's a big issue. We have a little piece about that in the book too.
I saw that.
Yeah.
So what I ask every